So we're finishing chapter 4 today. The evening the sitter came. Have you ever had a sitter or a babysitter? Not babies anymore, of course, but Charles William is. In the beginning of this chapter, poor Socks was just starving because he's on a diet. The baby formula had gotten him a little bit too heavy, so Mr. and Mrs. Bricker put him on a diet, and he went and searched in the neighborhood for some food, and he was completely unsuccessful. He was not able to find food to satisfy him. So now he's home again, and he noticed that Mrs. and Mr. Bricker are dressed to go out. Just got fed 4 pieces of meat, and while he was gulping them, the doorbell rang. The sound always unsettled him, but curiosity forced him to investigate. Mrs. Bricker opened the front door to a plump, elderly woman who was carrying a paper shopping bag and who introduced herself. I am Mrs. Risley from the Sitters Service Agency. Now, most of you have probably been babysat by an older brother or sister, or an aunt or uncle, maybe even your grandma or grandpa, or maybe even a neighbor. But there are companies out there who you can hire babysitters from. And it sounds like this nice old lady, elderly lady, is from there. Elderly means older. She entered and leaned her shopping bag against the chair with the loopy upholstery. Hello there, young man, she said to Charles William as she removed her coat and, without waiting to be asked, hung it in the closet beside the front door. Socks sniffed at the shopping bag, which had a tantalizing smell. He stood on his hind legs with his front paws against the chair and peered into the bag, but all he could see were some yarn and knitting needles. He dropped to all fours and sniffed again. Interesting. Well, hello, you old skeezicks. All cats were skeezicks to Mrs. Risley, who stooped to rub Socks behind his ears. My, aren't you a big, handsome boy with a nice, thick coat? Ooh, Socks is loving the attention. Look at his big belly. Socks sat down and looked up at Mrs. Risley with love in his eyes. Here at last was a true admirer, his first since the baby had arrived. Yeah, everyone else always gives the baby all the attention, right, kids? But not Mrs. Risley. Charles William has had his supper, said Mrs. Bricker, who had not trusted a stranger to feed her baby. But he will want a bottle when he goes down for the night. He's big enough to hold his own bottle now, and he doesn't need to be burped any more. And what about Skeezix? Asked Mrs. Risley. What do I feed him? He's been fed, answered Mrs. Bricker, with her eyes on her son. And don't let him tell you he hasn't been. He's quite a beggar, but for a while he was getting too big. For your supper there is. Oh, now don't worry about me, said Mrs. Risley. I always bring a meat pie with me. On these jobs you never know what you're going to find to eat. Some places all you get is a can of soup or a waffle. She reached for Charles William, who looked surprised and uncertain. He turned to his mother for some explanation and whimpered. Babies sometimes don't like to be held by strangers. He's going to be all right. Mr. Bricker firmly guided his wife to the door. Charles William began to cry, and Socks stopped his investigation of the shopping bag. He looked anxiously at the 3 adults, wanting them to take care of the baby. Now don't you worry about a thing, said Mrs. Risley. He'll stop crying as soon as you leave. They always do. Mrs. Risley was right. As soon as his parents disappeared, Charles William discovered the scarf below Mrs. Risley's chin and stopped crying. He had never seen a scarf like hers before and found it interesting. Yeah, he said. That's better, said Mrs. Risley, and sat Charles William in his playpen. She began to dig through her shopping bag. "I call this my survival kit," she said to Socks, who was staring into the bag to see if she had something for him. From the jumble of knitting, crayons, scissors, colored paper, magazines, and bedroom slippers, Mrs. Risley produced a roll of tape and, tearing off a piece, stuck it firmly to the big toe of Charles William's left foot. "There," she said, "that will keep you busy." Once again, she was right. Charles William stared at his toe in astonishment. Never before had he experienced tape on his toe. He lay back and waved his foot in the air. The tape stuck fast. "Fascinating. Aga, ga," he said. Have you ever stuck tape to a baby's toe? Neither have I, but it actually sounds like it might be a good trick. Mrs. Risley was now able to devote her entire attention to Socks. This remarkable woman, who knew where to find things in a strange house, found Socks's brush in the laundry room and went to work brushing him with long, firm strokes. Socks stood with his back braced and his chin raised, luxuriating in the tingle the brush brought to his skin. Oh, he loves it. All the time Mrs. Risley brushed, she talked. "Poor Skeezicks," she said tenderly. "With a baby in the house, he feels nobody loves him. Well, Mrs. Risley loves him." "Aw, Socks must be in heaven." With the tip of her finger, she rubbed his nose where the hair grew short and flat. How good it felt. "Oh, yes, he is a handsome boy." Socks agreed. He is a handsome boy, right? When Mrs. Risley cooked and ate her meat pie, she served Socks a morsel. "That's just a bit. Just enough so you won't feel left out," she explained. "We can't let such a handsome boy get fat now, can we? No, that wouldn't do at all." Somehow Socks did not mind receiving only one small bite of meat. He's just loving all the attention, isn't he? All right, by this time, Charles William had finished playing with the Scotch tape and was beginning to get cross about it. He had pulled it from his toe, stuck it to his right hand, and then his left, back and forth, and finally he got it to stick to Brown Bear. He did not want tape stuck to Brown Bear. Charles William fussed, and Socks looked anxiously to Mrs. Risley. "Socks doesn't like when the baby cries." "Now, don't you worry," said Mrs. Risley, pausing to stroke the tabby's head. "I'll be right back." Socks was so relaxed that only a moment seemed to go by from the time Charles William was lifted from his playpen until he was smacking away at his bottle in his bedside crib. Mrs. Risley pulled a magazine from her bag and plumped herself down on the couch, where she patted her lap. "Now," she said to Socks, as if this was the moment she had been waiting for. This was the moment Socks had been waiting for, too. He leaped lightly onto the babysitter's lap, which was large, soft, and smelled like flower-scented soap. Mrs. Risley had the perfect lap. What do you think the perfect lap would look like for a cat or feel like? What kinds of adjectives could you use? Soft, big, cushiony. Mrs. Risley had the perfect lap, a lap rarely experienced by a cat who lived in a world of people determined to stay thin. There's not as much cushion on a thin person, is there? Except for Sock's deep purr of contentment, the room was quiet. In Charles William's room, the smacking stopped, but this time Socks had no interest in leftover formula. He no longer had an empty feeling in his middle. The bottle fell out of the crib with a thump, and the silence that followed meant that Charles William was asleep for the night. Socks began to knead, that means to rub with his fingers, the perfect lap with his paws. In and out, in and out. His purr deepened, and a dreamy look came over his golden eyes. In and out, in and out. With his eyes half closed, Socks felt as if he were with his mother and the rest of his litter that he had almost forgotten. When baby kittens are drinking milk, they will go like this and need their mommy to get the milk to come. So it makes him feel comfortable and happy. Socks lost all interest in washing. He lay down on that perfect lap and wriggled until he was lying on his back with his 4 feet in the air and his back between Mrs. Risley's plump thighs. Gently, she stroked the silky fur on his belly. "Poor old Skeezicks," whispered Mrs. Risley as she stroked Socks's glossy fur. "You were starved for a little love." She turned the pages of her magazine carefully so they would not flick his whiskers and the sound would not disturb him. Gradually the purrs petered out, and with a final sigh, Socks fell into a deep sleep, the first perfect sleep he had enjoyed since Charles William had been carried home from the hospital. Mrs. Risley loved him more than she loved his rival. Who does Mrs. Risley love more? Socks. Who does she love him more than? His rival. His rival is the person that he competes against. Who is he trying to get food from? Who is he trying to get attention instead of? He's trying to beat Charles William for attention. He's trying to get attention from his Mr. and Mrs. Bricker, right? That's his rival. The baby is his rival. They're competing for attention.